Praeterita by John Ruskin, Volume 1, Chapter 1, The Springs of Wandel. I am, and my father was before me, a violent Tory of the old school, Walter Scott's school, that is to say, and Homer's. I name these two out of the numberless great Tory writers because they were my own two masters. I had Walter Scott's novels and the Iliad, Pope's translation, for constant reading when I was a child, on weekdays. On Sunday their effect was tempered by Robinson Crusoe and The Pilgrim's Progress, my mother having it deeply in her heart to make an evangelical clergyman of me. Fortunately, I had an aunt more evangelical than my mother, and my aunt gave me cold mutton for Sunday's dinner, which, as I much preferred it hot, greatly diminished the influence of The Pilgrim's Progress. And at the end of the matter was that I got all the noble imaginative teaching of Defoe and Bunyan, and yet am not an evangelical clergyman. I had, however, still better teaching than theirs, and that compulsorily, and every day of the week. Walter Scott and Pope's Homer were reading of my own election, and my mother forced me, by steady daily toil, to learn long chapters of the Bible by heart, as well as to read it every syllable through, aloud, hard names and all, from Genesis to the Apocalypse, about once a year. And to that discipline, patient, accurate, and resolute, I owe not only a knowledge of the book, which I find occasionally serviceable, but much of my general power of taking pains, and the best part of my taste in literature. From Walter Scott's novels, I might easily, as I grew older, have fallen to other people's novels, and Pope might perhaps have led me to take Johnson's English, or Gibbon's, as types of language. But once knowing the 32nd of Deuteronomy, the 119th Psalm, the 15th of 1 Corinthians, the Sermon on the Mount, and most of the Apocalypse, every syllable by heart, and having always a way of thinking with myself what words meant, it was not possible for me, even in the foolishest times of youth, to write entirely superficial or formal English. And the affectation of trying to write like Hooker and George Herbert was the most innocent I could have fallen into. From my own chosen masters, then, Scott and Homer, I learned the Toryism which my best afterthought has only served to confirm. That is to say, a most sincere love of kings, and dislike of everybody who attempted to disobey them. Only, both by Homer and Scott, I was taught strange ideas about kings, which I find for the present much obsolete. For I perceive that both the author of the Iliad and the author of Waverley made their kings, or king-loving persons, do harder work than anybody else. Tydides, or Idomeneus, always killed 20 Trojans to other people's 1, and Redgauntlet speared more salmon than any of the Solway fishermen, and, which was particularly a subject of admiration to me, I observed that they not only did more, but, in proportion to their doings, got less than other people. Nay, that the best of them were even ready to govern for nothing, and let their followers divide any quantity of spoil or profit. Of late it has seemed to me that the idea of a king has become exactly the contrary of this, and that it has been supposed the duty of superior persons generally to govern less, and get more than anybody else. So that it was, perhaps, quite as well that in those early days my contemplation of existent kingship was a very distant one. The aunt who gave me cold mutton on Sundays was my father's sister. She lived at Bridge End, in the town of Perth, and had a garden full of gooseberry bushes, sloping down to the Tay, with a door opening to the water, which ran past it, clear brown over the pebbles 3 or 4 feet deep, swift eddying, an infinite thing for a child to look down into. My father began business as a wine merchant, with no capital and a considerable amount of debts bequeathed him by my grandfather. He accepted the bequest and paid them all before he began to lay by anything for himself, for which his best friends called him a fool, and I, without expressing any opinion as to his wisdom, which I knew in such matters to be at least equal to mine, have written on the granite slab over his grave that he was an entirely honest merchant. As days went on, he was able to take a house in Hunter Street, Brunswick Square, number 54. The windows of it, fortunately for me, commanded a view of a marvelous iron post, out of which the water carts were filled through beautiful little trap-doors by pipes like boa constrictors, and I was never weary of contemplating that mystery and the delicious dripping consequent. And, as years went on, I came to be 4 or 5 years old. He could command a post-chaise and pair for 2 months in the summer, by help of which, with my mother and me, he went the round of his country customers, who liked to see the principal of the house, his own traveller, so that, at a jog-trot pace, and through the panoramic opening of the 4 windows of a post-chaise, made more panoramic still to me because my seat was a little bracket in front, for we used to hire the chaise regularly for the 2 months out of Long Acre, and so could have it bracketed and pocketed as we liked. I saw all the high roads, and most of the cross ones of England and Wales, and great part of lowland Scotland, as far as Perth, where every other year we spent the whole summer, and I used to read the Abbot at Kinross, and the monastery in Glenfarry, which I confused with Glendeary, and thought that the White Lady had as certainly lived by the streamlet in that glen of the Ochils, as the Queen of Scots in the island of Loch Leven. To my farther great benefit, as I grew older, I thus saw nearly all of the noblemen's houses in England, in reverent and healthy delight of uncovetous admiration, perceiving, as soon as I could perceive any political truth at all, that it was probably much happier to live in a small house and have Warwick Castle to be astonished at than to live in Warwick Castle and have nothing to be astonished at, but that, at all events, it would not make Brunswick Square in the least more pleasantly habitable to pull Warwick Castle down. And at this day, though I have kind invitations enough to visit America, I could not, even for a couple of months, live in a country so miserable as to possess no castles. Nevertheless, having formed my notion of kinghood chiefly from the Fitzjames of the Lady of the Lake, and of noblesse from the Douglas there, and the Douglas in Marmion, a painful wonder soon arose in my child mind why the castles should now be always empty. Tantallon was there, but no Archibald of Angus; Stirling, but no Knight of Snowdon. The galleries and gardens of England were beautiful to see, but his lordship and her ladyship were always in town, said the housekeepers and gardeners. Deep yearning took hold of me for a kind of restoration, which I began slowly to feel that Charles II had not altogether effected, though I always wore a gilded oak apple very piously in my buttonhole on the 29th of May. It seemed to me that Charles II's restoration had been, as compared with the restoration I wanted, much as that gilded oak apple to a real apple. And as I grew wiser, the desire for sweet pippins instead of bitter ones, and living kings instead of dead ones, appeared to me rational as well as romantic, and gradually it has become the main purpose of my life to grow pippins, and its chief hope to see kings. Footnote: the St. George's Company was founded for the promotion of agricultural instead of town life, and my only hope of prosperity for England or any other country, in whatever life they lead, is in their discovering and obeying men capable of kinghood. I have never been able to trace these prejudices to any royalty of descent. Of my father's ancestors I know nothing, nor of my mother's more than that my maternal grandmother was the landlady of the Old King's Head in Market Street, Croydon, and I wish she were alive again, and I could paint her Simone Memmi's King's Head for a sign. My maternal grandfather was, as I have said, a sailor, who used to embark like Robinson Crusoe at Yarmouth, and come back at rare intervals, making himself very delightful at home. I have an idea he had something to do with the herring business, but am not clear on that point, my mother never being much communicative concerning it. He spoiled her and her younger sister with all his heart, when he was at home, unless there appeared any tendency to equivocation or imaginative statements on the part of the children, which were always unforgivable. My mother being once perceived by him to have distinctly told him a lie, he sent the servant out forthwith to buy an entire bundle of new broom twigs to whip her with. They did not hurt me so much as one twig would have done, said my mother, but I thought a good deal of it. My grandfather was killed at 32 by trying to ride instead of walk into Croydon. He got his leg crushed by his horse against a wall, and died of the hurts mortifying. My mother was then 7 or 8 years old, and with her sister was sent to quite a fashionable, for Croydon, day school, Mrs. Rice's, where my mother was taught evangelical principles and became the pattern girl, and best needlewoman in the school, and where my aunt absolutely refused evangelical principles and became the plague and pet of it. My mother, being a girl of great power with not a little pride, grew more and more exemplary in her entirely conscientious career, much laughed at, though much beloved by her sister, who had more wit, less pride, and no conscience. At last my mother, formed into a consummate housewife, was sent for to Scotland to take care of my paternal grandfather's house, who was gradually ruining himself, and who at last effectually ruined and killed himself. My father came up to London, was a clerk in a merchant's house for 9 years, without a holiday, then began business on his own account, paid his father's debts, and married his exemplary Croydon cousin. Meantime, my aunt had remained in Croydon and married a baker. By the time I was 4 years old and beginning to recollect things, my father rapidly taking higher commercial position in London, there was traceable, though to me as a child wholly incomprehensible, just the least possible shade of shyness on the part of Hunter Street, Brunswick Square, towards Market Street, Croydon. But whenever my father was ill, and hard work and sorrow had already set their mark on him, we all went down to Croydon to be petted by my homely aunt, and walk on Duppus Hill, and on the heather of Addington. My aunt lived in the little house still standing, or which was so 4 months ago, the fashionablest in Market Street, having actually 2 windows over the shop, in the 2nd story. But I never troubled myself about that superior part of the mansion unless my father happened to be making drawings in Indian ink, when I would sit reverently by and watch, my chosen domains being, at all other times, the shop, the bakehouse, and the stones round the spring of crystal water at the back door, long since let down into the modern sewer, and my chief companion, my aunt's dog Towser, whom she had taken pity on when he was a snappish, starved vagrant, and made a brave and affectionate dog of, which was the kind of thing she did for every living creature that came in her way, all her life long. Contented by help of these occasional glimpses of the rivers of paradise, I lived until I was more than 4 years old in Hunter Street, Brunswick Square, the greater part of the year. For a few weeks in the summer, breathing country air by taking lodgings in small cottages, real cottages, not villas so called, either about Hampstead or at Dulwich, at Mrs. Ridley's, the last of a row in a lane which led out into the Dulwich fields on one side, and was itself full of buttercups in spring and blackberries in autumn. But my chief remaining impressions of those days are attached to Hunter Street. My mother's general principles of first treatment were to guard me with steady watchfulness from all avoidable pain or danger, and for the rest to let me amuse myself as I liked, provided I was neither fretful nor troublesome. But the law was that I should find my own amusement. No toys of any kind were at first allowed, and the pity of my Croydon aunt for my monastic poverty in this respect was boundless. On one of my birthdays, thinking to overcome my mother's resolution by splendor of temptation, she brought the most radiant Punch and Judy she could find in all the Soho Bazaar, as big as a real Punch and Judy, all dressed in scarlet and gold, and that would dance, tied to the leg of a chair. I must have been greatly impressed, for I remember well the look of the 2 figures as my aunt herself exhibited their features. My mother was obliged to accept them, but afterwards quietly told me it was not right that I should have them, and I never saw them again. Nor did I painfully wish, what I was never permitted for an instant to hope, or even imagine the possession of such things as one saw in toy shops. I had a bunch of keys to play with as long as I was capable only of pleasure in what glittered and jingled. As I grew older, I had a cart and a ball, and when I was 5 or 6 years old, 2 boxes of well-cut wooden bricks. With these modest, but I still think entirely sufficient possessions, and being always summarily whipped if I cried, did not do as I was bid, or tumbled on the stairs, I soon attained serene and secure methods of life and motion, and could pass my days contentedly in tracing the squares and comparing the colors of my carpet, examining the knots in the wood of the floor, or counting the bricks in the opposite houses, with rapturous intervals of excitement during the filling of the water cart through its leaden pipe, from the dripping iron post at the pavement edge, or the still more admirable proceedings of the turncock, when he turned and turned till a fountain sprang up in the middle of the street. But the carpet, and what patterns I could find in bed covers, dresses, or wallpapers to be examined, were my chief resources, and my attention to the particulars in these was soon so accurate that when at 3½ I was taken to have my portrait painted by Mr. Northcote, I had not been 10 minutes alone with him before I asked him why there were holes in his carpet. The portrait in question represents a very pretty child with yellow hair, dressed in a white frock like a girl, with a broad light blue sash and blue shoes to match. The feet of the child wholesomely large in proportion to its body, and the shoes still more wholesomely large in proportion to the feet. These articles of my daily dress were all sent to the old painter for perfect realization, but they appear in the picture more remarkable than they were in my nursery, because I am represented as running in a field, at the edge of a wood, with the trunks of its trees striped across, in the manner of Sir Joshua Reynolds, while two rounded hills as blue as my shoes appear in the distance, which were put in by the painter at my own request. For I had already been once, if not twice, taken to Scotland, and my Scottish nurse having always sung to me as we approached the Tweed or Esk, "For Scotland, my darling, lies full in thy view, with her bare-footed lassies and mountains so blue." The idea of distant hills was connected in my mind with approach to the extreme felicities of life, in my Scottish aunt's garden of gooseberry bushes sloping to the Tay. But that, when old Mr. Northcote asked me, little thinking, I fancy, to get any answer so explicit, what I would like to have in the distance of my picture, I should have said blue hills instead of gooseberry bushes, appears to me, and I think, without any morbid tendency to think overmuch of myself, a fact sufficiently curious, and not without promise, in a child of that age. I think it should be related also that having, as aforesaid, been steadily whipped if I was troublesome, my formed habit of serenity was greatly pleasing to the old painter, for I sat contentedly motionless, counting the holes in his carpet, or watching him squeeze his paint out of its bladders. A beautiful operation indeed, to my thinking, but I do not remember taking any interest in Mr. Northcote's application of the pigments to the canvas, my ideas of delightful art in that respect involving indispensably the possession of a large pot, filled with paint of the brightest green, and of a brush which would come out of it soppy. But my quietude was so pleasing to the old man that he begged my father and mother to let me sit to him for the face of a child which he was painting in a classical subject, where I was accordingly represented as reclining on a leopard skin and having a thorn taken out of my foot by a wild man of the woods. In all these particulars, I think the treatment or accidental conditions of my childhood entirely right, for a child of my temperament. But the mode of my introduction to literature appears to me questionable, and I am not prepared to carry it out in St. George's schools without much modification. I absolutely declined to learn to read by syllables, but would get an entire sentence by heart with great facility and point, with accuracy to every word in the pages I repeated it. As, however, when the words were once displaced, I had no more to say, my mother gave up for the time the endeavor to teach me to read, hoping only that I might consent in process of years to adopt the popular system of syllabic study. But I went on to amuse myself in my own way, learnt whole words at a time as I did patterns, and at 5 years old was sending for my second volumes to the circulating library. This effort to learn the words in their collective aspect was assisted by my real admiration of the look of printed type, which I began to copy for my pleasure, as other children draw dogs and horses. The following inscription, facsimiled from the flyleaf of my 7 Champions of Christendom, judging from the independent views taken in it of the character of the letter L, and the relative elevation of G, I believe to be an extremely early art study of this class. And as by the will of force, the first lines of the note, written after an interval of 50 years underneath my copy of it, in direction to Mr. Burgess, presented some notable points of correspondence with it, I thought it well he should engrave them together, as they stood. My mother had, as she afterwards told me, solemnly devoted me to God, before I was born, in imitation of Hannah. Very good women are remarkably apt to make away with their children prematurely, in this manner, the real meaning of the pious act being that, as the sons of Zebedee are not, or at least they hope not, to sit on the right and left of Christ in his kingdom, their own sons may perhaps, they think, in time be advanced to that respectable position in eternal life, especially if they ask Christ very humbly for it every day, and they always forget in the most naive way that the position is not his to give. Devoting me to God meant, as far as my mother knew herself what she meant, that she would try to send me to college and make a clergyman of me, and I was accordingly bred for the church. My father, who, rest be to his soul, had the exceedingly bad habit of yielding to my mother in large things and taking his own way in little ones, allowed me, without saying a word, to be thus withdrawn from the sherry trade as an unclean thing, not without some pardonable participation in my mother's ultimate views for me. For many and many a year afterwards, I remember, while he was speaking to one of our artist friends who admired Raphael and greatly regretted my endeavors to interfere with that popular taste, while my father and he were condoling with each other on my having been impudent enough to think I could tell the public about Turner and Raphael, instead of contenting myself, as I ought, with explaining the way of their soul's salvation to them, and what an amiable clergyman was lost in me. Yes, said my father, with tears in his eyes, true and tender tears as ever father shed, he would have been a bishop. Luckily for me, my mother, under these distinct impressions of her own duty, and with such latent hopes of my future eminence, took me very early to church, where, in spite of my quiet habits and my mother's golden vinaigrette, always indulged to me there, and there only, with its lid unclasped, that I might see the wreathed open pattern above the sponge. I found the bottom of the pew so extremely dull a place to keep quiet in, my best storybooks being also taken away from me in the morning, that, as I have somewhere said before, the horror of Sunday used even to cast its prescient gloom as far back in the week as Friday, and all the glory of Monday, with church 7 days removed again, was no equivalent for it. Notwithstanding, I arrived at some abstract in my own mind of the Reverend Mr. Howell's sermons, and occasionally, in imitation of him, preached a sermon at home over the red sofa cushions. This performance being always called for by my mother's dearest friends as the great accomplishment of my childhood. The sermon was, I believe, some 11 words long, very exemplary, it seems to me, in that respect, and I still think must have been the purest gospel, for I know it began with, "People, be good." We seldom had company, even on weekdays, and I was never allowed to come down to dessert until much later in life, when I was able to crack nuts neatly. I was then permitted to come down to crack other people's nuts for them. I hope they liked the ministration, but never to have any myself, nor anything else of dainty kind, either then or at other times. Once at Hunter Street, I recollect my mother giving me 3 raisins in the forenoon out of the store cabinet, and I remember perfectly the first time I tasted custard in our lodgings in Norfolk Street, where we had gone while the house was being painted or cleaned or something. My father was dining in the front room and did not finish his custard, and my mother brought me the bottom of it into the back room. But for the reader's better understanding of such further progress of my poor little life as I may trespass on his patience in describing, it is now needful that I give some account of my father's mercantile position in London. The firm of which he was head partner may be yet remembered by some of the older city houses as carrying on their business in a small counting-house on the first floor of narrow premises, in as narrow a thoroughfare of East London, Billiter Street, the principal traverse from Leadenhall Street into Fenchurch Street. The names of the 3 partners were given in full on their brass plate under the counting-house bell: Ruskin, Telford, and Domecq. Mr. Domecq's name should have been the first by rights, for my father and Mr. Telford were only his agents. He was the sole proprietor of the estate, which was the main capital of the firm, the vineyard of Marcharnudo, the most precious hillside for growth of white wine in the Spanish peninsula. The quality of the Marcharnudo vintage essentially fixed the standard of Jerez's stack, or dry, secco, sherries, or sherry, from the days of Henry V to our own, the unalterable and unrivaled chalk marl of it putting a strength into the grape which age can only enrich and darken, never impair. Mr. Peter Domecq was, I believe, Spanish-born, and partly French, partly English-bred, a man of strictest honor and kindly disposition. How descended I do not know. How he became possessor of his vineyard I do not know. What position he held when young in the firm of Gordon, Murphy and Company I do not know. But in their house he watched their head clerk, my father, during his 9 years of duty, and when the house broke up, asked him to be his own agent in England. My father saw that he could fully trust Mr. Domecq's honor and feeling, but not so fully either his sense or his industry, and insisted, though taking only his agent's commission, on being both nominally and practically the head partner of the firm. Mr. Domecq lived chiefly in Paris, rarely visiting his Spanish estate, but having perfect knowledge of the proper process of its cultivation, and authority over its laborers almost like a chief's over his clan. He kept the wines at the highest possible standard, and allowed my father to manage all matters concerning their sale, as he thought best. The second partner, Mr. Henry Telford, brought into the business what capital was necessary for its London branch. The premises in Billiter Street belonged to him, and he had a pleasant country house at Widmore, near Bromley, a quite far-away Kentish village in those days. He was a perfect type of an English country gentleman of moderate fortune, unmarried, living with 3 unmarried sisters who, in the refinement of their highly educated, unpretending, benevolent, and felicitous lives, remain in my memory more like the figures in a beautiful story than realities. Neither in story nor in reality have I ever again heard of or seen anything like Mr. Henry Telford, so gentle, so humble, so affectionate, so clear in common sense, so fond of horses, and so entirely incapable of doing, thinking, or saying anything that had the slightest taint in it of the race-course or the stable. Yet I believe he never missed any great race, passed the greater part of his life on horseback, and hunted during the whole Leicestershire season, but never made a bet, never had a serious fall, and never hurt a horse. Between him and my father there was absolute confidence, and the utmost friendship that could exist without community of pursuit. My father was greatly proud of Mr. Telford's standing among the country gentlemen, and Mr. Telford was affectionately respectful to my father's steady industry and infallible commercial instinct. Mr. Telford's actual part in the conduct of the business was limited to attendance in the counting-house during 2 months at midsummer, when my father took his holiday, and sometimes for a month at the beginning of the year, when he travelled for orders. At these times Mr. Telford rode into London daily from Widmore, signed what letters and bills needed signature, read the papers, and rode home again. Any matters needing deliberation were referred to my father, or awaited his return. All the family at Widmore would have been limitlessly kind to my mother and me, if they had been permitted any opportunity. But my mother always felt in cultivated society, and was too proud to feel with patience the defects of her own early education, and therefore, which was the true and fatal sign of such defect, never familiarly visited anyone whom she did not feel to be in some sort her inferior. Nevertheless, Mr. Telford had a singularly important influence in my education. By, I believe, his sister's advice, he gave me, as soon as it was published, the illustrated edition of Roger's Italy. This book was the first means I had of looking carefully at Turner's work, and I might, not without some appearance of reason, attribute to the gift the entire direction of my life's energies. But it is the great error of thoughtless biographers to attribute to the accident which introduces some new phase of character all the circumstances of character which gave the accident importance. The essential point to be noted and accounted for was that I could understand Turner's work when I saw it, not by what chance or in what year it was first seen. Poor Mr. Telford, nevertheless, was always held by Papa and Mamma primarily responsible for my Turner insanities. In a more direct, though less intended way, his help to me was important, for before my father thought it right to hire a carriage for the above-mentioned midsummer holiday, Mr. Telford always lent us his own travelling chariot. Now, the old English chariot is the most luxurious of travelling carriages, for 2 persons, or even for 2 persons in so much of third personage as I possessed at 3 years old. The one in question was hung high, so that we could see well over stone dykes and average hedges out of it, such elevation being attained by the old-fashioned folding steps, with a lovely padded cushion fitting into the recess of the door, steps which it was one of my chief travelling delights to see the hostlers fold up and down, though my delight was painfully alloyed by envious ambition to be allowed to do it myself. But I never was, lest I should pinch my fingers. The dickey, to think that I should never till this moment have asked myself the derivation of that word, and now be unable to get at it, being typically that commanding seat in Her Majesty's mail, occupied by the guard, and classical, even in modern literature, as the scene of Mr. Bob Sawyer's arrangements with Sam, was thrown far back in Mr. Telford's chariot, so as to give perfectly comfortable room for the legs, if one chose to travel outside on fine days, and to afford beneath it spacious area to the boot, a storehouse of rearward miscellaneous luggage, over which, with all the rest of forward and superficial luggage, my nurse, Anne, presided both as guard and packer. Unrivalled she, in the flatness and precision of her inlaying of dresses, as in turning of pancakes. The fine precision, observe, meaning also the easy wit and invention of her art, for no more in packing a trunk than commanding a campaign is precision possible without foresight. Among the people whom one must miss out of one's life, dead, or worse than dead, by the time one is past 50, I can only say for my own part that the one I practically and truly miss most next to father and mother, and putting losses of imaginary good out of the question, is this Anne, my father's nurse and mine. She was one of our many being always but few, and from her girlhood to her old age, the entire ability of her life was given to serving us. She had a natural gift and specialty for doing disagreeable things, above all the service of a sick room, so that she was never quite in her glory unless some of us were ill. She had also some parallel speciality for saying disagreeable things, and might be relied upon to give the extremely darkest view of any subject, before proceeding to ameliorative action upon it. And she had a very creditable and republican aversion to doing immediately or in set terms as she was bid, so that when my mother and she got old together, and my mother became very imperative and particular about having her teacup set on one side of her little round table, Anne would observantly and punctiliously put it always on the other, which caused my mother to state to me every morning after breakfast gravely that if ever a woman in this world was possessed by the devil, Anne was that woman. But in spite of these momentary and petulant aspirations to liberality and independence of character, poor Anne remained very servile in soul all her days, and was altogether occupied from the age of 15 to 72 in doing other people's wills instead of her own, and seeking other people's good instead of her own. Nor did I ever hear on any occasion of her doing harm to a human being, except by saving 200 and some odd pounds for her relations, in consequence of which some of them, after her funeral, did not speak to the rest for several months. The dickey then aforesaid being indispensable for our guard, and was made wide enough for two, that my father might go outside also when the scenery and day were fine. The entire equipage was not a light one of its kind, but, the luggage being carefully limited, went gaily behind good horses on the then perfectly smooth mail roads, and posting in those days being universal, so that at the leading inns in every country town the cry, "Horses out," down the yard, as one drove up, was answered, often instantly, always within 5 minutes, by the merry trot through the archway of the booted and bright-jacketed rider, with his caparisoned pair. There was no driver's seat in front, and the 4 large, admirably fitting and sliding windows, admitting no drop of rain when they were up, and never sticking as they were let down, formed one large moving oriel, out of which one saw the country round, to the full half of the horizon. My own prospect was more extended still, for my seat was the little box containing my clothes, strongly made, with a cushion on one end of it, set upright in front and well forward between my father and mother. I was thus not the least in their way, and my horizon of sight the widest possible. When no object of particular interest presented itself, I trotted, keeping time with the postboy on my trunk cushion for a saddle, and whipped my father's legs for horses, at first theoretically only, with dexterous motion of wrist, but ultimately in a quite practical and efficient manner, my father having presented me with a silver-mounted postilion's whip. The midsummer holiday, for better enjoyment of which Mr. Telford provided us with these luxuries, began usually on the 15th of May, or thereabouts. My father's birthday was the 10th. On that day, I was always allowed to gather the gooseberries for his first gooseberry pie of the year, from the tree between the buttresses on the north wall of the Hernhill garden, so that we could not leave before that festa. The holiday itself consisted in a tour for orders through half the English counties, and a visit, if the counties lay northward, to my aunt in Scotland. The mode of journeying was as fixed as that of our home life. We went from 40 to 50 miles a day, starting always early enough in the morning to arrive comfortably to 4 o'clock dinner. Generally, therefore, getting off at 6 o'clock, a stage or two were done before breakfast, with the dew on the grass, and first sent from the hawthorns. If, in the course of the midday drive, there were any gentleman's house to be seen, or better still a lord's, or best of all a duke's, my father baited the horses, and took my mother and me reverently through the staterooms, always speaking a little under our breath to the housekeeper, major domo, or other authority in charge, and gleaning worshipfully what fragmentary illustrations of the history and domestic ways of the family might fall from their lips. In analyzing above, page 8, the effect on my mind of all this, I have perhaps a little antedated the supposed resultant impression that it was probably happier to live in a small house than a large one. But assuredly, while I never to this day pass a lattice-windowed cottage without wishing to be its cottager, I never yet saw the castle which I envied to its lord, And although in the course of these many worshipful pilgrimages I gathered curiously extensive knowledge both of art and natural scenery, afterwards infinitely useful, it is evident to me in retrospect that my own character and affections were little altered by them, and that the personal feeling and native instinct of me had been fastened irrevocably long before to things modest, humble, and pure in peace, under the low red roofs of Croydon, and by the crest-set rivulets in which the sand danced and the minnows darted above the springs of Wandel.